She fled her toxic marriage and boarded a plane without realizing that the man seated beside her was a kingpin of the criminal underworld. And for 6 months, Claire Bennett had lived like a shadow inside her own home. 6 months, hiding bruises beneath long sleeves, and a smile borrowed from old memories. 6 months forcing herself to smile through pain and whisper apologies for faults that were never hers. The clock on the kitchen wall no longer merely counted the hours but measured the slow erosion of her spirit, and every slam of a door, every sweep of polished leather shoes across the cold marble floors of the Seattle mansion sounded like a warning shot. Her husband, Richard Hale, smiling endlessly from the covers of business magazines, appearing at major conferences, shaking hands with the most powerful men. Yet behind closed doors he never let Claire forget who held the leash. And there was a time when she believed he had saved her, pulled her out of crushing debt and the hollow loneliness of that tiny apartment long ago. But fairy tales have castles and castles have doors that lock from the outside. And on a quiet morning at 4:05, while the house still slept beneath a soft blanket of money and silence, Claire slipped away without a luxurious suitcase and without expensive jewelry, carrying only a passport hidden inside a cookbook, a worn wallet secretly hand-stitched through countless long nights, and a heart still learning how to name courage. She bought a one-way ticket to Boston under her old name, not a false one, but to her it felt like a second chance. And when she settled into seat 12C by the window, she believed she was alone on this journey until the man beside her turned and looked at her with a gaze unlike any she had known for years. Not the look of desire or pity, but the look of someone who had seen something broken and had quietly decided to repair it. And this is a story of escape, of power, of fear, and of the precise moment when a woman stops being prey and becomes something far more dangerous, her freedom. If at this very moment you are holding your breath with every heartbeat of Claire inside that narrow cabin of the airplane, if you can feel the trembling not only from the sky but from the turning of her fate itself, then pause for just 1 second to subscribe to our channel, press like and share this story with the people you hold dear, so that each day we may continue to listen together to many more profound stories like this one. And where are you watching from? From a quiet room, from a familiar street corner, or from somewhere very far away? Leave us a comment to tell us where you are listening from, so we may know just how far this story has traveled and which hearts it has touched. The plane began to roll down the runway, the roar of the engines beating like a drum that urged Claire to leave behind everything that had once imprisoned her. She sat silently beside the small oval window, her eyes fixed on the dim gray sky beyond where clouds drifted past, as if concealing an entirely new world waiting ahead. In the seat beside her, the man in a dark gray shirt and thick wool coat had not spoken a word, yet his presence made the narrow space around them feel strangely quieter and safer. And when the aircraft lifted from the ground, Claire tightened her grip on the armrest, her arm tensing by instinct, her heart racing not from fear of flying but because her mind still could not quite believe she had truly left that place, left Richard, left the mansion that weighed on her like a prison plated in gold. Less than 10 minutes after the plane leveled at cruising height, an abrupt turbulence struck. A cold current slid through the cabin and the aircraft lurched sharply to the left, making many passengers gasp. Claire startled and her body tipped instinctively toward the seat beside her. Her coat collar slipped down, revealing a long blue-purple bruise stretching from her shoulder blade to her collarbone. She pulled the fabric back at once, but it was too late. The man beside her had seen it. He turned toward her, his gaze calm, without surprise and without pity, only a clear awareness as if he had seen hundreds of bruises like that before, and each one told a story others did not wish to hear. Claire turned away, trying to appear normal, but she could not control the faint trembling of her hand on her knee. He did not speak immediately, only leaned slightly and pressed the call button for the flight attendant, then stopped without pushing it. She glanced over, his blue-gray eyes looking straight ahead, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and without judgment. Cabin pressure often makes headaches worse, especially if there is an injury. If she wished he could call for an ice pack or some pain medicine, Claire did not answer. She merely gave a small nod, uncertain whether it meant agreement or simply thanks for his restraint in not asking more. The man remained still, his hand resting lightly on the armrest between them, not invading her space yet close enough that if she needed support it was there. He added almost in a whisper that if she felt uncomfortable with the turbulence, she could lean on his shoulder to help stabilize herself. No hidden meaning, merely a way to ease the strain. Claire bit her lower lip, her thoughts spinning between caution and survival instinct. It had been so long since anyone had offered something without demanding something in return. She hesitated, then slowly inclined toward him, her shoulder brushing the soft fabric of his coat. He did not move, only tilted his head slightly so she could lean more comfortably. He adjusted the cold air from above to just enough, and returned to silence. For the first time in many weeks, Claire's breathing steadied, each breath growing lighter and deeper. Outside, the clouds continued to collide and drift. Inside the cabin, she closed her eyes, her back resting against a complete stranger, yet feeling as though she were leaning into a peace she had never known. And the man, who had not asked her name and had not given his own, simply sat there, silent as a solid wall between her and the dangerous world beyond. Claire did not know when she drifted into sleep. She only remembered the warmth of the woolen shoulder beside her, the faint scent of cedarwood and mint, and the steady rhythm of the engines rocking her into a half-dream between waking and rest. She did not dream, but she felt a fragile safety wrap around her, as if her body had grown too exhausted to defend itself any longer. In that moment, she was no longer in Seattle, no longer in the house where every footstep had to be calculated and every word could ignite rage. She was only an unnamed passenger, quietly leaning against an unfamiliar man 30,000 feet above the earth. The man did not stir. He adjusted his posture just enough so her neck would not tilt, just enough so his coat retained a gentle warmth around her shoulders. His hand remained resting lightly on his own thigh, not invading, not suggesting. Perhaps he understood that a single misguided gesture would make her recoil and shatter the fragile distance they had built. Instead, he chose to become a silent support, a gentle wall, a barrier that did not trespass. When the flight attendant pushed the service cart past, he merely shook his head slightly. Sometime later she woke, not from noise or turbulence, but from a body long trained to never rest deeply. Her eyes opened to the soft white light of the cabin, and the awareness that her head was still resting on someone's shoulder. Startled, she tried to pull back, but his hand stopped her, not with force, but with a light touch on her shoulder through the fabric. "It is all right." His voice was low, quiet yet firm. She looked up, her eyes lost and faintly embarrassed. "I am sorry," she whispered. He shook his head, his gaze without reproach. "There is no need to apologize." She sat upright, adjusting her coat and avoiding his eyes. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Yet the air between them had shifted. The lurking vigilance was gone, the invisible boundary no longer drawn tight as a wire. Claire leaned forward to take the cup of water the attendant had placed while she slept. Her hand trembled slightly, but his gaze never left her, as if ensuring she could manage on her own, not out of doubt, but out of readiness to intervene if needed. She took a small sip, set the cup down, then turned to him, her voice as soft as wind through a narrow crack in a door. "My name is Claire." It was the first time she had spoken her own name since leaving that house. The man gave a slight nod. Julian Cross. He did not offer his hand and did not smile. He simply confirmed his existence. Claire nodded. "Thank you for not asking." Julian looked straight ahead and said that he had learned sometimes the best thing one person can do is sit still and ask no questions. Sometimes silence is the only thing that keeps someone from breaking apart. Claire turned back to the window, where layers of cloud fell away beneath pale sunlight. For the first time in many weeks, she did not feel as though she were suffocating. She still did not trust anyone, not even Julian, but at least in this moment she no longer felt entirely alone, and that, for someone who had lived too long in darkness, was almost a miracle. As the airplane began its descent, the change in air pressure made Claire's ears throb. Yet she barely noticed. Outside the window, the Boston sky appeared in cold shades of gray, thin bands of cloud like early morning mist, the ground below revealing rooftops, buildings and highways interwoven like a maze of a new life. She felt her body draw inward, alert to every slight vibration as the landing gear prepared to touch the runway, not from fear of landing, but because she knew that beyond the aircraft doors lay reality, people who knew her face, the possibility of being recognized, the thin line between escape and being dragged back. Julian remained silent the entire time. He said nothing when the flight attendant announced the landing and did not look over when the plane touched down with a long screech along the wet runway. Yet Claire knew he was still aware of her from the slight angle of his shoulder toward her, and the way his eyes flicked toward the aisle as passengers began to rise. When the seatbelt chime sounded, Claire stood and pulled her small backpack from beneath the seat, her movements decisive yet unhurried. Julian stayed seated. Before she turned to leave, he took from the inner pocket of his coat a black business card with no logo, only a name and a string of numbers. He held it out, his gaze neither pleading nor commanding. "This is not an offer, only an option. If she should ever need a temporary place or help of any kind at any time, She hesitated, her eyes skimming the card then lifting to his, her voice quiet but clear that she thought she should manage on her own. Julian nodded as if unsurprised and replied that even the strongest sometimes need a wall to lean against. She looked at him for another second, then reached out and took the card, not slipping it into her wallet nor holding it merely out of courtesy. She opened her backpack, unzipped a small side compartment, and placed it deep inside with her passport and the remaining cash. When she closed the zipper, Julian rose to his feet and wished her luck. She did not answer but inclined her head. She stepped into the crowded stream of passengers, her backpack on her shoulder, her gaze forward as if she were an ordinary traveler returning from a trip. Yet inside her heart hammered. Outside the airport, she inhaled the damp scent of rain and the sharp cold of Boston. She pulled her coat close and summoned a ride with a second-hand phone bought for a few $dozen with no email logged in and no bank account attached. As the car pulled away, Claire glanced into the rearview mirror. She did not see Julian, and no one followed her. Yet a strange, quiet sensation lingered behind her. Not a person but an idea. The idea that someone knew, that a door somewhere stood open waiting if she truly needed it. And the business card in that small compartment, though she had refused it, still lay there as a silent choice. A name, a phone number, an unanswered question. She did not know if she would ever use it, but she knew that for the first time in many years she had the right to choose, and that now was more precious than anything. The hotel Claire chose stood on a damp corner in the southern part of Boston, nearly half an hour's drive from the airport, far enough from elegance and ordinary enough that no one paid attention to a lone woman with a quiet gaze and a small backpack. Her room on the second floor had a tiny window overlooking a narrow alley between two aging brick buildings. Inside, the scent of cheap deodorizer mixed with the must of damp carpet thickened the air. The bed creaked whenever she shifted, and the heater veered between too hot and too cold. Yet the place had a lock on the inside, curtains that fully closed, and no curiosity as long as she paid in cash each day, and that was enough. On her first morning in Boston, Claire woke beneath pale sunlight filtering through wrinkled curtains with an unfamiliar clarity. There were no male footsteps in the hallway, no voice calling her name with sweetness sharp as a blade, no fear crouched beneath every breath, only the distant wail of traffic, the scrape of a garbage cart, and the murmur of a television from the next room. She rose, pulled on her coat, went out to buy a weak cup of coffee from a nearby convenience shop, then returned to her room and switched on the television simply for the sound. She had no intention of watching anything in particular, only of filling the silence. Yet within seconds the sound froze her where she stood. The morning news showed a man in a suit, standing in the corridor of a luxurious building in Seattle, as the reporter's voice carried evenly over the image. Billionaire Richard Hale had officially filed a missing person report for his wife, Claire Bennett, who was believed to have left home for unknown reasons. The screen shifted to an old wedding photograph, then to an image of Claire beside her husband at a charity event, in a pale blue dress with a smile that never reached her eyes. Her body went rigid and her heart raced. He had begun. He had officially turned her escape into a disappearance. On the screen, the reporter continued that sources said Hale was cooperating with private security forces and might offer a reward for information leading to her recovery. Claire shut off the television at once, and the room became so silent she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. She rose, drew back the curtain and checked the window. The alley lay empty save for a cat leaping from a trash bin and vanishing behind a wall. Yet she knew this was only the first step. When Richard moved, he would not stop at the news. He had money, people and systems. He knew how to make everything appear legal and turn her into the madwoman, the unreasonable runaway, the woman who had betrayed the perfect husband in the eyes of the media. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched together, her palms slick with sweat. She had no concrete plan, only to leave, to survive each day and to avoid being found. But now she understood that simply leaving was no longer enough. She needed a next step, a place to hide, a way to erase her trail, a strategy to survive. In that moment, she thought of the black business card lying in the small pocket of her backpack between her passport and what little cash remained. Claire did not take it out. She only closed her eyes, drew a long breath, and admitted to herself that loneliness was tightening around her like an invisible rope. And what frightened her more than Richard was having no one to call when the nightmare began to return. Claire lived quietly for 2 more days in that worn old room, leaving the hotel only when absolutely necessary and always wearing a baseball cap and a face mask when she went outside, buying canned food, avoiding eye contact, learning to move like a shadow through the crowd. But that fragile peace was as delicate as a still lake before the wind, and on that morning when she went down to the front desk to extend her stay by 2 more nights, there was something different in the gaze of the young receptionist, The polite smile lingered a second too long, and Claire felt it instantly, like the sensation of a door slamming shut behind her without warning. She returned to her room with uncertainty tightening in her chest. 20 minutes later, as she sat on the edge of the bed, she heard 3 knocks at the door, quick and firm, not the kind made by housekeeping. Her heart clenched. She said nothing, only moved softly toward the door and looked through the peephole. A man in a leather jacket stood there with his back turned, speaking into a phone. Not the police and not hotel staff. A cold current slid along her spine. She stepped back and reached for her backpack. Her mind held only one thought: leave now. But as she moved toward the window, a voice came from behind the door. Not loud, yet clear enough through the crack. She is here. Room 21. I am sure. Claire froze. There was no longer any doubt. He had found her. Not Richard himself, but one of his men, or someone bought with reward money. She hurriedly pulled open her backpack and shoved everything inside, wrapped her coat around her shoulders, and was about to head for the back exit when a sharp knock sounded at the rear window and a shadow appeared against the blurred glass. But it was not the same man. It was Julian. Claire gasped before she could react, and he raised his hand with his index finger to his lips, then pointed behind her. She turned and heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. Julian mouthed without sound, and his eyes said enough. Do not speak. She stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure whether it was fear or the shock of his sudden presence. In the next instant, the main door was struck again, harder than before. Claire knew that if she hesitated, everything would end here. Julian pointed to the window latch, signaling. She hesitated for exactly 1 second, then turned it. The window opened without a sound, and Julian reached in and pulled her out with a swift and steady motion. They ran along the rear corridor and crossed a narrow passage leading to an outdoor iron staircase. Claire did not ask why he had come or how he knew. She only knew that as her feet hit the cold concrete behind the hotel, the sound of her old room door being battered echoed sharply above. Julian pushed her into a black car waiting just a few steps away. The door opened to reveal an older man in the driver's seat with sharp, calm eyes. Julian closed the door behind her and signaled for the car to move. Claire sat gasping for breath, her fingers still clenched around the strap of her backpack. Julian turned to her, looked straight at her, and said in a low, steady voice that he had told her if she needed a safe place she should call. She had not called, but he came because that morning's news said Richard had offered a reward of $500,000 for any information, and a sum like that made people reckless. Claire did not reply. She only looked at him with a tight ache in her chest. Julian saw it, but did not press her. He leaned back and looked out the window like a man long accustomed to living in shadow, always ready when another person's darkness began to move. The car slipped quietly into a narrow road between tall concrete buildings, as yellow streetlights painted dull streaks across the glass. Claire sat motionless in the back seat, her gaze still fixed on the window, her fingers lightly gripping the backpack on her lap. She had not spoken a word since leaving the hotel, and Julian did not force her. The driver asked nothing and drove in silence, as though everything had been prepared in advance. When the car stopped before a nearly anonymous building with no sign and no display windows, Claire hesitated. The gray facade and unmarked steel door looked like an abandoned warehouse. But when Julian stepped out and pressed his finger to a concealed keypad, the door opened soundlessly to reveal a spotless corridor flooded with even white recessed lighting. And Claire knew this was no temporary refuge. Inside was a perfect silence wrapped in invisible layers of security. They took an elevator to the highest floor, with no lobby button or floor numbers, only an electronic key held to the panel. When the doors opened, she stepped into a space that made every luxury hotel seem ordinary, a vast apartment with high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city, the Boston nightlights shimmering like thousands of unspoken promises. The interior was minimalist, elegant, and so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. There was no scent of candles or flowers, only clean wood and cold metal, like the man who stepped in slowly, slipped off his coat and turned to her. He told her she did not have to stay if she did not wish to, that this was one of the safest places he had, that no one knew it except him and the driver, that the codes changed every 24 hours, that there were no cameras inside and no staff, only stillness. Claire stood near the door with her backpack still on her shoulders, her eyes scanning every detail for an invisible trap. Julian saw it and did not come closer. He only gestured toward the left corridor and said there were 3 bedrooms, that the innermost room was prepared with clean clothes and personal necessities, and that she could lock the door if she wished and he would not enter. Claire hesitated. She did not trust easily, but she also knew that if he had found her at the old hotel, then every similar place was no longer safe, And strangely, though she had known Julian less than 48 hours, his presence did not make her shrink as she once did. He did not press, did not probe, did not ask questions she was not ready to answer. She nodded faintly and said only a few nights. Julian said nothing more. He went to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, poured water into a glass, and set it on the table near the sofa, telling her that there was food inside if she was hungry. Nothing fancy but enough for the night. Claire walked slowly down the corridor and opened the innermost room. Soft, warm light spilled from a lamp already on. The sheets were white and crisp, the pillows neatly arranged, and a folded set of sleepwear lay at the foot of the bed. Everything had been prepared with intention, yet nothing felt controlling. She stood there for a long time, before gently setting her backpack down and sitting on the edge of the bed. The Boston night was colder than Seattle, but for the first time in many weeks she did not shiver with fear. Outside the large window, the entire city burned with light. Inside the closed door, only the sound of her heart remained as it slowly found again the rhythm of life. The next morning, when Claire stepped out of the bedroom, the apartment was so quiet that for a moment she felt as though she were the only person inside it. Muted sunlight filtered through the wide glass panes, laying pale, golden streaks across the floor. Julian sat at the dining table with his laptop open before him, and his phone set beside it without a sound, without a word, only the preserved hush of a silence that felt like an unspoken agreement. Claire moved slowly toward the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and sensed his gaze resting on her without intrusion. There was no good morning, no questions, no measuring look. She took a seat 2 empty chairs away from him and placed her hand lightly on the cool surface of the table. After a few quiet seconds, Julian closed the laptop and lifted his head to her, his expression calm. He did not force a smile and did not soften the moment. He simply said in a low, steady voice that he did not need to know her past, did not need her to tell her story until she was ready, and that he would not touch her even by accident, that this was a safe space, and she had every right to keep her silence for as long as she wished. Claire looked at him, and her eyes were no longer as cold as on the first night, but shimmered with something closer to gratitude. Not because he was kind, but because he understood. In a world that always demanded reasons to help, Julian asked for no explanation from her at all. She nodded, a small gesture, but waited. The entire morning passed in quiet. Julian stayed in one corner reading documents and answering a few messages without once mentioning leaving or any plans for her. Claire spent most of the time in her room. But at noon she came out and found a book already set on the table, a worn paperback of short stories without a visible title. She took it to the sofa and read, occasionally lifting her eyes toward the glass wall. No one intruded on the other's space. No one asked if she had slept well, and no one filled the void with hollow words. And strangely, that was what made everything easier to breathe. In the afternoon, when Julian stood to leave, he spoke only one sentence, saying he would be gone for 2 hours, and that if she needed anything, there was a list of emergency numbers in the first kitchen drawer. He did not ask her to watch the place, did not caution her, and did not study her reaction. He left as if he trusted she would still be there when he returned. And when the door closed behind him, Claire sat alone in the vast apartment, and for the first time did not feel confined. The stillness here was nothing like the rooms that had once trapped her. It carried no invisible walls of surveillance, no cameras and no schemes, only choice. If she wished to leave, she could, and if she wished to stay, no one would stop her. It was a strange, fragile freedom. Like glass, yet it made her feel, for the first time in many years, that she no longer had to fold herself inward merely to survive. And when Julian returned later, hung his coat on the hook, and did not ask what she had done during his absence, she knew that a boundary had been quietly set between them. A boundary without fences, built only of silence, and that silence was the first slow foundation of trust taking shape. Rain began to fall in the late afternoon, drops tapping rhythmically against the glass as though someone were lightly drumming time upon the face of the city. Claire curled into the sofa with a thin blanket wrapped around her legs and a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. Julian stood in the kitchen, opened the liquor cabinet, let his hand pass over a few bottles, then chose a dark whiskey, poured 2 glasses, and set one on the table near her. Claire looked at the glass, then at him without asking why and without refusing. Julian sat across from her, leaned back slightly into the chair, and his eyes were no longer as distant as in the first days, but seemed to soften as if within him too. A long sealed door had shifted. He took a sip and looked out the window, his voice ragged as if he could not breathe without letting the words go. He said his sister's name was Lillian and that she was 6 years younger than him. That she loved to draw like Claire, but unlike her, she never had the chance to leave. Claire said nothing, but her gaze held fast to his lips as if to catch every word. Julian continued slowly that she had loved the wrong man. The first time he hit her, she said she had fallen. The second time she said she had walked into a door, and the third time she said nothing at all. that she died on a winter night in a bathtub with bruises no one wished to see. Julian paused, and his eyes darkened dangerously, though his voice remained even as he said he had arrived too late, far too late, and that since then he had never again trusted silence. Claire set her teacup down, and her hand touched the whiskey glass without lifting it. She stared into the amber liquid, as if staring into her own depths, and when she spoke her voice was almost a whisper as she said, "The first time he hit her was because she forgot to place his shirt in the right spot. The second time because she forgot to turn off the gas. And after that she no longer had anything left to forget, yet he still beat her." Claire did not cry, but her eyes shone with something heavier than tears, as the stories within her unraveled like old stitches being pulled one by one. Slow and painful, yet necessary. She said there was a time she tried to leave and he dragged her back. Knelt down, apologized, swore he would change, and cried. She believed him, and 3 days later, he threw her phone into the toilet and told her she did not need the outside world. Julian did not interrupt. He simply sat there like a wall that knew how to listen. And the whiskey in his hand remained full, as if pain had drained all thirst from him. Claire lifted her eyes to his without defenses and without pretending to be strong, and said she had never told anyone because she was afraid that once she heard her own voice speak it, she would no longer be able to deny it. Julian set his glass on the table, and the quiet touch of crystal to wood sounded like a wordless vow. He did not reach for her, did not hold her, and did not say he was sorry. He only stayed there with her in the shared breaking. And in that silent moment between a long rain and two souls long suffocated by loss, something fragile took shape. Not love and not salvation, but empathy, deep and quiet and more real than any promise. The next morning the apartment was flooded with soft golden light. Thin bands of sunlight slipping through the glass and spilling across the wooden floor, wrapping everything in a fragile warmth as Claire stepped out of the bedroom, with her hair slightly tousled and an oversized sweater draped over her slender frame. Julian was already gone. Yet on the dining table sat a large paper box placed neatly with a small note clipped on top, the handwriting brief and sharp in ink, saying that he thought she might need this. Not for any grand reason, but simply because her hands had not forgotten how to create beauty. Claire touched the note as if touching an old memory, opened the box, and inside found brand new tubes of acrylic paint, brushes of various sizes, a wooden palette, thick drawing paper, and a foldable easel. No flowers, no scented candles, no hollow words. Only a quiet set of tools filled with meaning, as if someone had silently seen the part of her she had tried to bury. She did not rush to take up a brush, but sat there for a long time gazing at the colors as though at something unfamiliar. Her hands, once accustomed to oil paint, once lost for hours mixing colors, tracing curves on human faces, sketching dreams onto canvas. Yet it had been many years since the last time she painted something that was not criticized, not corrected, not turned into a decorative object for his mansion. When Julian returned at noon, she was still sitting before the box of paints. He asked nothing, only set a bag of food on the kitchen counter, opened it and placed out 2 portions of hot noodles with some toasted bread. They ate in silence without conversation, yet a space between them seemed to be filled by an invisible accord. In the afternoon, Claire opened the easel and laid paper upon it. Not a large painting and not an ambitious work, only a few sketch lines, a slanted rooftop, a row of trees casting shadows, a small arm with a hand reaching toward the light. The hand had no face and no body, yet there was something alive within the stroke. Julian did not come closer, but stood at the kitchen doorway, his eyes resting on the paper like those of a careful observer. He did not say whether the drawing was beautiful or not. He only nodded faintly and turned away to let her continue. And that evening Claire painted more, one picture and then another, each image a fragment of memory transformed without order and without need for explanation. She did not realize how long she had been painting until her hand ached, and the lamplight softened into a whisper, and she finally set the brush down. Julian placed a blanket over her shoulders near midnight when she had fallen asleep on the sofa with the drawing board tilted beside her. There was no calling of her name, and no lifting her in cinematic fashion back to bed, only a blanket laid at the right moment, and a gaze that lingered long enough to ensure her breathing was steady. And in that moment, though nothing was spoken, both of them knew that Claire had begun to paint again, not only on paper but upon herself, as layers of color gradually covered the gray that had clung to her soul for so many years. A new canvas was slowly opening, and this time the strokes belonged to her alone. 3 days after Claire began painting again, Julian left the apartment very early in the morning. He did not say where he was going, but the way he wore a dark shirt, fastened his cufflinks, and carried a thick file in his leather case changed the air of that morning. Claire watched him through the glass with quiet unease, yet did not ask. She understood that from the moment she revealed a fragment of the truth about Richard, the man who sat across from her that night had begun to plan, Not a plan of rescue, but a plan of hunting. In another room without paintings or gentle light, Julian sat among 3 men in plain clothes. One opened a laptop while another placed a thick stack of files on the table. Julian gave a small nod and issued the first order to track all abnormal transfers linked to the shell companies registered under Richard's name over the past 6 months. He knew well the laundering model Richard used for this layered corporate structure to conceal money was a familiar game in Julian's world. The third man, a former investigative journalist who had worked with Julian in dealings darker than any headline, was tasked with locating witnesses who had once worked in the Hale mansion. Maids, former drivers, dismissed housekeepers, all were potential links. Every small lead, from rumors to deleted messages, was gathered. They did not seek to destroy Richard in a mafia manner, but to break him with truth. Julian did not wish to kill him, not from mercy, but because Richard deserved to endure the naked exposure of law and justice. He should fall in the light, not vanish in the dark as a mystery. A week later, Julian's team produced a preliminary report that Richard had been regularly paying cash to a phantom advertising company, registered under the name of a man who had died 3 years earlier. The Seattle mansion had been transferred through 4 legal entities within 12 months, showing clear signs of asset laundering. At the same time, 2 former employees from the mansion reached out. One admitted having seen Claire dragged forcefully into a room with muffled screams, yet dared not intervene for fear of losing her job. The other held copies of internal security camera footage that Richard believed he had erased completely. Julian ordered everything extracted. Each detail was a link, and Richard himself was tightening the chain with his own arrogance and confidence that no one would dare touch him. That evening, when Julian returned to the apartment, he did not recount everything to Claire, but his eyes were no longer cold as before. They were tense, like a man who had stepped deep into the scent of blood while wearing white shoes. Claire noticed. She did not ask, and only poured him a glass of water and set it on the table as he once had for her. Julian took it and sat down, his gaze resting on the unfinished painting she was working on of a room without doors, and a woman standing between light and shadow. He did not comment on whether the painting was beautiful or not, but for the first time he asked how she wanted Richard to pay. Claire lifted her eyes to him, her voice steadier than she herself expected, and said she did not want him dead. She wanted him to live, and no longer have anyone believe the image he had created. Julian nodded, because true justice did not lie in a bullet but in pulling him into the light, where everything he had hidden would ignite on its own, and he was ready to be the one who carried the torch. Claire sat alone in the living room, the light from the ceiling lamp falling over her hair in a pale halo. On the table before her lay the thick file Julian had left behind, still unopened, her hand resting on its cover, trembling slightly. Inside that folder was everything Julian and his team had gathered over the past 2 weeks: records of irregular financial transfers, witness statements, photographs of bruises on her body, video extracted from the internal cameras of the mansion she once believed had been erased forever. All of it lay there in silence, waiting for her to do the one thing she had never dared to imagine. The cup of tea beside her had gone cold untouched. Beyond the glass wall, the city of Boston was lighting up, its hurried rhythm unaware that in a high-floor apartment a woman was struggling with herself. She had once dreamed of escaping Richard, once believed that leaving would be enough. But now, when all the evidence was laid bare, when Julian's hand was extended and ready to catch her if she stepped forward, she felt herself pulled back by something stronger than fear itself. Memories of being dragged across cold stone floors, of his voice carving slow, deliberate words into her mind like knives, of the eyes at parties where everyone saw, yet no one spoke, and above all, the memory of herself, the woman who had stayed silent, who had smiled to keep the peace, who had believed endurance was a form of love. Julian did not pressure her. He had left only one sentence before going out: "When you are ready, just say the word." Yet the truth was that no one was ever truly ready to uncover their own past. Claire rose and stepped onto the balcony, still gripping the file like an invisible weight. The night wind brushed her cheek and cleared her mind. She lifted her eyes to the sky, where dark clouds drifted quietly like time itself. Then she opened the file. The first page was a surveillance photograph of her with reddened eyes and her hand covering her cheek. The second page showed Richard smiling confidently on a magazine cover beneath which lay a ledger of his hidden assets. Every page after that was a truth, an accusation, a piece of darkness torn into the light. She read it all. Nearly 3 hours passed. When Julian returned, he found her seated at the dining table, her eyes no longer clouded like mist but sharp as glass. She did not speak much, only one sentence, clear as a bell echoing through a cathedral. She said she would testify, not for him, not for justice, but because she no longer wanted to be a victim, Julian did not answer with words. He simply nodded, and in that moment something changed direction. She no longer needed him to run. She needed him to move forward, and he knew the battle was no longer his alone. Claire would stand before the public, not as a ghost of the past, but as a survivor, no longer a woman whose voice had been stolen, but one who reclaimed it with every breath, every steady gaze, every word spoken beneath the blinding lights of truth. Because sometimes courage does not live in grand gestures, but in the moment a woman opens the file, draws a deep breath, and finally dares to speak her first true word. Julian stood before the wallboard covered in notes, financial connection diagrams, photographs, and red ink markings like an invisible battlefield. The light in his workspace softened behind half-drawn curtains, leaving only the warm desk lamp illuminating the lines like cuts through time. Claire entered with a cup of coffee in her hand, set it gently on the table, and silently sat beside him. She did not need to ask what he was doing because now she was part of the plan. Her eyes settled on Richard's photograph pinned at the center of the board, his polished, arrogant smile gleaming like varnish. Julian followed her gaze, then turned to face her, his voice low and firm as he said he would not kill him. Claire did not react at once, but looked at him as if to be sure she had heard correctly. Julian continued, his eyes never leaving hers, making her understand this was not weakness but a choice. Death for a man like Richard would be far too easy an escape. He would be pitied, turned by the media into a victim of shadowy forces. His cruelty would be buried with his body, and the survivor like her would once again be pushed into silence. Claire stayed quiet a long moment, then nodded. There would be no blood, no bullet chambered. She had chosen to fight with truth, and she needed someone at her side who chose the same path. Julian lifted another folder and placed it before her. This was the strategy. Step by step, they would pull Richard out of the artificial light he had built for himself. Starting with his finances, they would send the files to 3 major newspapers, but not all at once. The first article just enough to stir public uproar, while he scrambled to contain the damage. They would release the second wave with evidence of money laundering and bribery of officials, and when he was reeling under the weight of a media storm, the final blow would fall at a press conference organized by Richard himself, and the person who would step forward would not be Julian but Claire. She would walk into the light as a living witness, as the true victim, bearing proof in her hands and needing no accusation beyond her own existence. Julian looked straight into her eyes and asked a simple question that weighed like stone. "Are you certain?" Claire nodded, not only because she wanted this to end, but because she wanted to be the one to tear down Richard's final mask with her own hands. Julian exhaled softly, releasing a measure of tension, turned back to the board and marked key timelines, media contacts, and selected journalists. Everything would be tightly controlled. No leaks. No room for Richard to counterattack in advance. This was not revenge, but a strategic unmasking. Claire rose and moved closer to the board, took a marker and circled a single date on the small calendar below. That would be the day they faced him. No blood would be spilled. No one would fall in the dark. Only the truth would be brought into the light, and this time she would be the one to light the torch. The hotel stood in the heart of downtown Boston, a grand old building renovated with massive crystal chandeliers and corridors lined with velvet thick red carpets, and Julian had chosen it not only for its location but for how public it was. Because an event held here among hundreds of people with the presence of media and business elites from everywhere would be the perfect stage for a play in which Richard himself did not yet know he was the central character. Richard Hale had just organized an international investment conference, an occasion to flaunt his power and reinforce his reputation amid the murmuring crisis. The first articles had been released a week earlier, revealing not only suspicious money transfers but also subtly hinting at unverified allegations of abuse. Richard appeared in the press as a man being smeared by competitors, and it was he himself who ordered the press conference combined with a reception at this luxury hotel to reaffirm his status. And that was precisely the trap. Julian used old connections to slip Claire's name into the guest list under a new identity. She would not stand at the podium. She would not need to say anything before the cameras. She only needed to be present at the right time, the right place, under the right light. Julian sent private invitations to 3 of the most respected media outlets and a group of independent journalists known for exposing major scandals. Each received a verified copy of the dossier with a short line attached, "Let the truth speak." Claire was trained in silence for 5 days. She learned how to hold her gaze steady before the lens, how to control her breathing, how to nod instead of accuse. She did not need to shout that she was a victim. She only needed to stand there and let her eyes do the rest. On the night before the event, Julian gave her a cream-colored dress, not to make her more beautiful, but so she would stand out among the dark-clothed crowd. He did not touch her. He only left the dress in the room and quietly closed the door. In his mind, this was the final battle, not between him and Richard, but between Claire and the old shadow of herself. The next morning, the Boston sky was clear yet cold. A kind of cold that seeped into the bones and made one more alert than coffee ever could. Claire stepped out of the car driven by Julian, her low heels pausing on the hotel steps with a faint tremor. Julian followed one step behind her, said nothing, only placed his hand on her back for a brief second like a silent vow. Inside the grand lobby, Richard was standing at the center of a circle of people, his face still wearing the confident smile that had made so many believe in him. He did not see Claire at once, but the cameras did. A young reporter was the first to recognize her. His eyes widened and his grip tightened on his camera. A subtle but razor-sharp current ran through the hall. Claire said nothing. She simply stood there, her eyes fixed on the man who had once been the nightmare of her life. No accusation, no challenge, only silence. And her presence at that moment was the greatest accusation of all. Richard turned when the silence began to spread through the hall, the air suddenly thick as though all eyes were converging on a direction he had not yet understood. His gaze caught Claire among the crowd, her hair falling softly, the lights shaping her face as if she had stepped out of an old dream. For a moment he did not believe his eyes. Claire stood there, neither shrinking back nor bowing her head, her eyes meeting his without trembling, without fear, but with a calm forged through months of silence. Julian stepped to her side, said nothing, yet his stance was like a solid wall standing between her and the world that had once shattered her. His arm lifted and presented a hard-bound folder without logo or name, only a plain black cover cold in its simplicity. A reporter stepped forward to receive it and opened it before the cameras. Inside were copies of illegal financial transactions, documents proving Richard had laundered money through multiple shell companies, testimonies from former employees, and most of all images of Claire from her days inside the mansion, wounds on her wrists, bruises along her back, extracts from the security footage showing her being shoved against a wall. No screams, only frozen despair. Richard took one step forward, his hand trembling slightly as he struggled to hold his composure. He smiled a hollow smile and declared it a conspiracy, a fabrication, a staging by rival enemies. His voice attempted control, yet beneath the words everyone could hear a single truth: fear. Claire did not speak. She did not need to. The large screens in the hall began to display short clips verified by the 3 major media outlets. Each image rose like a blade, driven straight into the reputation Richard had painstakingly built. Murmurs broke out and swelled into direct questions hurled at his face. Who is Claire Bennett? Is she your wife? Did you ever beat her? How do you explain these transactions? Richard stepped back one pace. Julian stepped forward one. They did not touch, yet the space between them was the boundary between two worlds. One man who had once stood in the light now trembling before the darkness of his own making, and one woman who had once been buried in silence now stepping forward with the truth. Claire turned to Julian, then to the crowd before her. In that instant, a deep current swept through her, not fear but release, as if years of repression had finally been lifted from her body. She did not need victory. She only needed the truth made public, and that had happened. Richard was surrounded by questions, flashes, and the punishment of eyes that had once admired him and were now cold as steel. Claire stood still like one who had cast the first stone into the glass wall of lies and did not need to look back to know it would collapse. Julian placed his hand on her back once more, this time as a quiet message through the body: "It is finished." And in that chaos of voices and light, they turned away not to flee but to move forward, because the truth had been spoken through silence, through images, through a steady gaze, and through the courage of a woman who had once been a victim and was now a witness. Only 30 minutes after the press conference, a line of unmarked police vehicles pulled up before the hotel, and men in black suits bearing the insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation swept into the lobby like a cold wave cutting across a once still lake. Richard had not yet managed to leave the venue when he was surrounded by 4 federal agents. The sharp click of metal cuffs tightening around his wrists echoed through the sudden hush like steel slicing through a reputation once polished with money and lies. Some people stood frozen. A few reporters lifted their cameras by pure instinct as flashes erupted to capture the instant an empire collapsed in full daylight. He shouted his protests, invoked lawyers and his right to remain silent. Yet this time no one defended him. The hands that had once shaken his, and the voices that had toasted him now stood like cold statues. Claire remained in the shadows at the edge of the hall, her heart racing but her face unchanged. Julian stood beside her without letting his eyes leave her for a second. When Richard was led past them, his gaze found Claire, and in it there was no arrogance, no defiance, only shock, as though until the final moment he still could not believe that the woman who had once knelt before him could bring down everything he had built over 30 years in a single morning. The hotel doors slammed shut behind the agents, and the air slowly loosened, whispers rising into sound as if everyone needed noise to confirm they were awake. Julian turned toward Claire as she stood motionless with both hands clenched and her shoulders trembling. He said nothing and simply moved closer, laying his hand in silence upon her shoulder. Claire released a long-held breath and suddenly collapsed into him, covering her face as sobs broke free beyond her control. Yet these were not tears of fear or pain but of release. For the first time in countless years she no longer feared footsteps behind her, no longer woke with her heart constricted by a ringing phone, no longer apologized for sins that were never hers. She cried because she was alive and because she had walked out of the darkness on her own feet. Julian held her without tightening his arms, only enough for her to know he was there, and that she was no longer alone. Within that embrace, everything finally broke open like a flood after a breached dam. Every silent endurance and every stifled scream washed clean in the moment. No hand held the chain anymore. When she lifted her head, her eyes were red, but her gaze had changed, and within it lived the Claire of today. No longer the woman trapped inside a gilded cage, but one who had stepped out, stood upright, and continued living. Julian brushed her cheek and nodded in quiet recognition. This battle had not been hers alone, but the victory belonged entirely to her. 3 months after Richard's arrest, Claire walked onto the speaking platform in a small yet dignified hall at the Boston Public Library, where soft light settled on her hair and eased every tense gaze fixed upon her. She wore a pale blue dress, simple and graceful, and no longer stood as a woman in hiding or a trembling victim behind another's back. Today she was the founder of the Silent Light Foundation, an organization supporting women who had endured emotional and physical abuse, where stories like hers were no longer whispered in darkness, but spoken with courage and received with respect. Her speech was not long and did not plead for pity or bear the weight of heroism. She spoke only of a woman who once believed herself dead, while still breathing, and who believed silence was the only way to survive until one day she chose to speak. Claire did not mention Julian, and did not need to. That man was a low, steady note within the music of her life, indistinct yet indispensable. He vanished only 1 week after Richard's arrest, without farewell or trace, leaving behind only a small scrap of paper upon the wooden table in the old safe apartment where they had once shared quiet nights and fragile trust. The note held a single line saying that she had found herself and that was enough, and that the rest belonged to her. Claire kept that paper as a keepsake, not of love but of the first freedom ever given without demand in return. Her name appeared in newspapers again, yet this time as a catalyst for change, rather than a figure in scandal. She refused all invitations to exploit her private life, and chose to share her story only where it could truly reach those who needed it. The foundation began receiving letters from survivors in trembling lines and broken words, sometimes only a single sentence saying, "Thank you for surviving." Claire read every letter and every confession, as though each were a shard of glass reflecting her own past. She organized small gatherings where women sat together without makeup and without needing to appear strong, simply present and brave enough to speak. Among all these milestones, what filled Claire with the deepest pride was not the donations nor the media attention, but the day she saw a young woman walk into the foundation, with eyes lost in shadow, and months later watched that same woman rise to lead a new support group with a voice that no longer trembled. Sometimes in the late afternoons when sunlight stretched across the wooden floor of her office, Claire thought of Julian not with longing but as a beautiful memory that knew when to leave. He did not belong to the light, yet he had stepped out of the darkness only to guide her into it before vanishing as if he had never existed. But Claire knew that though he was no longer beside her, a part of him lived on within everything she now did, needing no presence, only the knowledge of having once touched her life. And sometimes that was enough. The official launch gala of the Silent Light Foundation was held in a historic building in the heart of Boston, where even the stone tiles seemed to hold the echoes of stories that had never been told. Claire wore an elegant black dress with her hair swept into a high knot, her gaze calm yet luminous, with a confidence tempered by time. The grand hall was filled with soft jazz, gentle laughter, the clink of glasses, and steady words of congratulations, like the rhythm of a heart that had found its way again. Claire moved from table to table, shaking hands, smiling, thanking people, accepting flowers and well wishes from sponsors, supporters and new friends along her rebirth. Yet deep in her eyes there remained a nameless hollow, a pause yet to be filled, a breath still missing something to be truly whole until she turned back from the stage and met that gaze. He stood at the far end of the room, not approaching and not speaking, simply there as if he had never left. Julian in a gray suit without insignia, and without any trace of the old world he once belonged to. Yet in his eyes Claire recognized it instantly, the stillness of one who had walked through fire, and once more chosen to stand where there was light. She did not rush and did not pretend not to see. She crossed the congratulating crowd as if there were only one thing left to do that night. When she stood before him with only a few breaths between them, the whole world seemed to fall silent. Julian looked at her, did not smile, only gave a slight nod and said softly that he had not meant to disrupt anything, and that he only wished to see her one more time. Claire was silent. She looked straight into his eyes and saw there the same man who once stayed quiet so she could cry, who once gave her her first paintbrush after years of forgetting, who once kept his promise not to kill the man who destroyed her life, though it would have been as easy as breathing. She asked him why now without accusation or tears, only a bare question. Julian exhaled slowly and said, because he needed to know whether she still needed him, not to save her but to walk forward with her. The words fell into the quiet between them like a pebble rippling water that had been still too long. Claire did not answer at once. She looked around the room at the women who once lived in silence, now laughing and speaking and leading their children and sharing dreams of peaceful days. She turned back to Julian and felt that her heart was no longer afraid of the past of wounds or of loving again. She said softly that if he stayed, no darkness could be carried along. Julian nodded and said he brought only himself. In that moment, no embrace was needed and no vows were spoken, only presence and eyes meeting in understanding, not because they needed each other to survive, but because they chose each other to live. After the gala, Claire did not return to the spacious apartment where she lived alone, but chose to walk beside Julian, along the banks of the Charles River, where city lights reflected on the water like drifting strands of memory. The night wind was cool, carrying unspoken questions and answers that needed no words. Julian walked beside her as always, without demand or haste, simply an unbroken presence that no longer left Claire feeling empty. They stopped beneath a weeping willow, where darkness interwove with streetlight, creating a strange meeting place of peace and uncertainty. Claire looked straight at him, and for the first time since the night they reunited spoke that she had once feared his world and believed the only way to survive was to flee from everything, but that she had been wrong not because she needed to return to darkness, but because she learned she could bring light into it. Julian did not respond at once, and looked at her as if searching a depth of the soul no one had dared touch. He said his world was not clean and did not resemble what she was building, and that some things still continued and still had to be done, because without men like him standing in between, everything would collapse faster than they hoped to change it. Claire nodded and said she knew, and that she did not come to cleanse it but to stop running from it. She stepped closer, almost within his breath, and said that if he still stood between two sides, she wished to stand beside him, not to pull him to her side, but so they could keep their balance together. Julian let out a breath, not of weariness, but like one who had held it too long and was finally allowed to release it. He reached out and touched her wrist lightly as if to confirm she was truly there and truly saying those words. He whispered that she did not need to change to enter his life, and that he would never let her trade away anything of herself. Claire smiled gently yet with resolve and said she was not trading but choosing, and that this was the first time in her life she had truly chosen anything for herself. In that moment, in the interwoven light and shadow, there was no longer a victim and no longer a savior. Only two people once crushed by forces beyond their control, now standing upright facing the world and each other, not to hide or evade but to live together fully. Julian said nothing more and simply extended his hand, this time not as a fleeting touch but as a true invitation. Claire placed her hand in his without hesitation, and when their fingers closed together they moved forward, not sheltering in the light and not fearing the dark, because they understood that only by daring to touch both could one ever be truly free. They did not end with a fiery embrace beneath a blazing sunset or a kiss in the rain like in old romantic films. Claire and Julian chose a different kind of ending, one that was quiet, honest, and grown. They did not need vows carved into the wind or promises sworn beneath the stars. They needed only a silent agreement that tomorrow, when they woke, they would still be there, seated across from one another with their morning coffee, sharing a silence no longer forced and glances that no longer had to hide. They chose to remain together, not to save one another from the ghosts of the past, but to honor the scars those ghosts had left, because they understood that a person does not need to be perfect to be worthy of love, only brave enough to step forward and stay, while the other is still learning how to trust again. Claire continued her work with the Silent Light Foundation, expanding its reach to many other states, and training those who were once victims to become sources of support for others, and Julian did not fully return to his old world yet. Neither did he abandon his role of preserving balance within a complex reality. He became a bridge between power and conscience, using his quiet authority to create change from within, with patience and resolve. They did not resemble the romantic couples so often seen, and precisely because of that their story became extraordinary. In this world, no one is ever completely white or completely black. There are only those who dare to admit they have fallen and still choose to rise again. Life never offers us an easy straight path. Sometimes only after passing through countless dead ends, wounds, and darkness do we discover that true light does not come from outside but from deep within ourselves. The story of Claire and Julian stands as proof that happiness does not come from finding a perfect person, but from finding someone willing to walk beside us through both light and shadow, not forcing us to erase the past, but embracing it as an inseparable part of who we are. If you are watching this video and feel a sense of connection, please leave a comment below. What do you think about the journey of Claire and Julian? Was there a moment that moved you? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? We truly wish to hear the voice of your heart, because perhaps your story will become the light for someone out there who is still searching for a way out. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel, like and share this video, so you will not miss the deeply emotional and human stories we bring every day. Your support is the very motivation that allows us to continue creating meaningful and inspiring content. We wish everyone watching this video good health, peaceful days, and a life filled with quiet joy. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.